So I am here in a new apartment. I have like a little bookshelf with all my little books, but I wanted to be really cozy right now. So I'm kind of filming in this place. I realize the lighting's a little weird, like it's not the end all be all. I will try to find a more normal location, especially because of how loud this is. I think there's like some gaps in my window, so it is quite noisy, I will admit. But it doesn't really bother me like in living, but in like filming stuff like this, it's a little awkward when you can hear very loud noises from outside. Today I'm going to be doing a reading wrap up for October. And now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure I know all the books I finished, but also I will consult my notes. So the first book that I finished this year, I actually have already made a separate video about, and that is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. As mentioned in that video, this is the story of a little girl who feels very different from her family and copes with the difficulty that she's facing in her life through imagination, through escapism. There are some like kind of magical realism. I don't know, I feel like I call everything magical realism. Like there's some like fantastical elements to this book. And I do think it's quite a unique look at what it means to be different in society, how you have to deal with those differences. Whereas I think Convenience Store Woman dealt more with what's it like when maybe you're not interested in pursuing the same things that everyone around you is. I think in this way, it's like how trauma can leave you ostracized and how then normative relationships or anything can feel very alien, make you feel very alien to you, but then make you feel like an alien in response. So this book is also very intense, very weird. It has a lot of creepy, gory elements. Not even gory, just like creepy. Honestly, not even creepy, just like intense. There's a lot of intense stuff that happens. And I do feel that in some places, I think, depending on what kind of a reader you are, they may be more distracting than they are like illuminating, you know? It almost feels like this story could have been told without those elements and still have the same impact. Next up, I read In the Miso Soup by Murakami. That is a psychological thriller about a young man, I can't remember his name, a young man, and he works kind of adjacent to the sex industry where he takes tourists around to show them, like a tour guide. Okay, sorry, my roommate's dog is hitting the... So he is the tour guide for the sex industry, and he gets this American tourist. The American tourist immediately creeps him out, and we happen to know that at the same time there's been a murder in the area. And so what I find really fascinating about this book is, as much as it is a psychological thriller, there's gore, there's like seedy underworld discussions, it is also a book profoundly about the differences between like Japanese culture and foreign cultures, specifically American culture. It's critical of both the Japanese interest in the West and the Western interest in the Japanese. And it discusses, I think, a lot of the people who are not necessarily left behind, but I think it discusses a lot of people who feel out of place, like they don't have prospects. It paints a portrait of a part of Japan that I especially think like the US doesn't really get a lot. We don't really get a lot of discussion about poverty. You know, a lot of it's very, I wouldn't even say glamorized, but orientalized. Like we look at Japan and we see it as this profoundly different world. And I don't think that the book tries to say that Japan isn't different from the West and America specifically, but I think it tries to, it does a good job of saying like, here are struggles that people have here, like poverty. And I found it fascinating. I found it's like a very weirdly paced book. I think Chapter Stack said that in her review of it a couple years ago. It's very weirdly paced, but I like how throughout the whole book we're still hearing and learning about these characters. We're understanding them more the entire time, and there never really feels like there's a point where you're not getting some insight into how our main character views the world around him. Okie dokie, after that, so Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. I want to do a very long and in-depth video about this book because I find there are several big themes that come out through the book. The first of which is, what are the ethics of having people pay to be on this mountain, people who are not good mountaineers? What is this doing, for like the climbing culture in general? What is this doing for the safety of the people involved, from the guides to the Sherpas? And, you know, even like a discussion of the environmental impact of having all these people on this mountain, especially when they're there for what essentially amounts to bragging rights for a lot of them. These are not people who are necessarily like passionate, highly experienced mountain climbers. Not to say that they aren't people who've climbed mountains, it's just that they're not necessarily in like the caliber of mountain climbers who can like go to the other 8,000 meter mountains. You know, they're not necessarily that good. And the story, so if you don't know, in 1996, a kind of storm came up, and it at that point had been one of the deadliest years in Everest's history. And there's a lot of stuff that makes this particular event really interesting. Famously, a man by the name of Weathers, a Texan physician, was sort of in a way like left for dead. He was almost dead and was able to like get back up, get his way back into the camp in the middle of a storm, and then was almost left for a second time. But they were able to get him down off this mountain from what everyone assumed was like, he is not going to, like, no one thought this man was going to make it, and then they like see him like literally like a ghost. And I think the book questions a lot of the morality, and I think at first I was really critical of Krakauer as a narrator because, in my opinion, he has a vested interest in aligning himself with certain things. Like, he aligns himself as being a very passionate man who loves mountaineering. He is one of the ones who's there because of his love for the mountain. The book is questioning people who pay and use their exorbitant wealth to get access to this mountain. So he positions himself as firmly lower to middle class in comparison to people like Weathers, who was a very wealthy physician. So he's really trying to create these dichotomies, and he's making clear which side of the aisle he is on. And he even brings up the fact that he disagreed with Beck politically, and, you know, Beck is, he's a physician from Texas. You don't have to think too hard about it, like what his views are. And so in the beginning, I was kind of like, well, okay, you're trying to have this conversation, and you're also trying to make it really clear who you are in this space. But what I will say is, I don't think that Krakauer made this book to describe his own heroism. I think he does a really good job of telling events that he, in a lot of ways, was tangentially there for. He makes it very clear that even him being there as a journalist might have affected the outcome of what was happening on that mountain. He talks about other wealthy kind of celebrity clients who are on the mountain. I think he does a good job of looking at the failures and the accidents that led to the disaster. And this is a nonfiction book, which I think is pretty easy to get through, because especially towards when you're actually up there, like when it's November 10th, I believe, May 10th. When it is May 10th is coming around, the book gets chaotic, especially, young lady, can we do that later, please? She has to groom herself. It gets chaotic, and especially like you hear all of these things, all of these kind of mistakes that were made, or things that made stuff difficult, and miscommunications, and it is gut-wrenching because you realize that so much of this was like, you're essentially dying at that altitude, being on Everest, and so you can't rely on anybody else. You can't say, I have to trust this person. That person is also dying. You can trust your guides, but guess what? Those guides, they're also dying because your whole body is not able to tolerate that. You can have oxygen, but like you're still just slowly suffocating essentially. There's not enough oxygen for you to perform basic functions. You're going up in this mountain delusional. I've talked a lot about this book so far, but I think it is very good. I think it's very interesting. And I think it makes you question, what kind of person would you be? Would you be the person who turned around in order to survive? Would you be able to leave people if you thought for sure they were dying? Like, what are the ethics of being in a place where saving someone's life might cost you your own? You know, like risking it to help someone, like that's actually, you're literally risking your life to do that. It's a good book. You should read it. And I'm very interested in seeing other books by Krakauer, ones where he is not so like internally involved, because I do think that was some of my original complaint about the book, where I was kind of like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, towards the end, I think he does a good job of being very aware of the mistakes he made and the fact that he was no hero in the story. Not that he was like, I don't personally think reading this he was an antagonist, but it's not a story about like, I'm the one who saved this. Like, there's a very big mistake he makes that has like repercussions for a victim's family. Yeah, good book. So, I also finished audiobook of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. The audiobook is so beautiful. She's such a powerful orator, and I don't know a lot of Maya Angelou. I don't know a lot of Maya Angelou's like poetry. I'm not very informed on all that, but I did think it was really beautiful to read about her experiences being in the South, and you know, hearing about this woman and her escapism into books and literature, and I feel like she's the original like romanticize your life girl. I feel like she did that a lot, and there's some like deep trauma that she experienced, but she also felt a deep connection to her family, you know, specifically Mama and her brother Bailey. And she was this shy, quiet girl, but when it came down to it, when she needed to help herself, when she had a goal, she was able to achieve it, and I found that really beautiful. And I love the way that like race is described in this book. I love how, you know, Angelou doesn't ever let the reader forget that she is like happy to like to her blackness is so, I mean, obviously it's personal, right? But it's also so deep and special and connective. And I like that, because I think that as a white reader reading this, it's, you get the feeling she's like, she's reinforcing, and all the time she says this, she's reinforcing the problem is not her blackness, it is the white supremacist systems which are keeping blackness down, which does feel like it's very obvious, right? That's not something that necessarily needs to be explicitly stated, but I think the reminder of it reinforces like this is a product of a bad ruling system. That was nice. This girl is so needy for belly rubs and pets. Okay, the last book that I read, I finished this morning, but I read like 90% of it before today. So today's November 1st. And that is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This was for a book club that I'm a part of, and wowza. This is dark. I will read the back of this book. When global climate change and economic crises lead to social chaos in the early 2020s, California becomes full of dangers, from pervasive water shortages to masses of vagabonds who will do anything to live to see another day. 15-year-old Lauren Olamina lives inside a gated community with her preacher father, family, neighbors, sheltered from the surrounding anarchy. In a society where any vulnerability is a risk, she suffers from hyper-empathy, a debilitating sensitivity to others' emotions, and also like their physical feelings. Like if someone bleeds, she, as a child, would also bleed. Precocious and clear-eyed, Lauren must make her own voice heard in order to protect her loved ones from the imminent disasters her small community stubbornly ignores. But what begins as a fight for survival soon leads to something more, the birth of a new faith, a startling vision of human destiny. So I don't think that's a terrible back of the book, but the truth is it's more like we are reading the journals of a woman who will eventually become seen as a prophet. It's almost like we're seeing her in a way describe what she sees as Earthseed, this faith that she's like you would call like inventing, but she's saying she's describing it, she's noticing it and writing it down, right? So it's almost the almost like a biblical text, hearing your prophets stories while they're also describing what their faith means. And it's a very, so there's a lot of very dark and horrible things in this book. It's, I would argue, very triggering, you know? And at the same time, I think there is something kind of hopeful in the story, something akin to even from the ashes we will rise. The faith that is described in the book is called, like I said, Earthseed, and it essentially revolves to this idea that God is change. Here is kind of one verse, I would call it, about Earthseed. God is power, infinite, irresistible, inexorable, indifferent. And yet, God is pliable. Trickster, teacher, chaos, clay. God exists to be shaped. God is change. And a lot of this book, a lot of the faith in this book comes from the idea that change is this ever-present force. But in responding to change, change can be a force for good and a force for evil. You can work with change. You can cause change. It's this sort of symbiotic, quasi-symbiotic relationship. And the goal of Earthseed, in her mind, this like future destiny for humanity, is to go to the stars and to plant Earthseed, to like spread the seeds of this faith of humanity onto other planets. But it is described and understood as this very distant future that they are now just beginning. This is truly just the little seeds being dropped into the soil to potentially, like after millennia, grow into this like tree of being in the stars. And I think the book describes too a lot of inequities and injustices from like racial lines, wealth gaps, drug abuse, like systems of power such as corporations and labor, police and people who need the police to do literally anything, and like how communities and families have to protect themselves. There's a lot of things that feel very much grounded in today and in the struggles of today, just amped up to 10. And I think that Lauren, the main character, she's quite interesting because she really is very like determined, and she, the whole time, I don't think she does a lot of what I would call changing and evolving. But what I also like about the story is she's not this figure that is what, like, while she may not necessarily have this huge change, she does what I would say she has to prove her beliefs, or she has to defend them. She's not in a world where she just says something and everyone's oohing and awing. She's not necessarily someone who has immense charisma. She just has that tenacity that people get drawn to. I would also say that this is not a book about morality. Like we were talking about that in my book club. We're like, is Lauren a good character? And the truth is, I don't think it's about her being a good character. I think there's not that morality. Like, it's truly, how do you adapt and respond to change? How do you survive? How do you get by? And so the questions are not, are you good or are you bad? It's, did you make it? Did you live another day? I really do think everyone should read this. So when I was first introducing this, I knew almost nothing. I just sort of heard it was like it was like A Handmaid's Tale, but so much better. And I do think it's very much a more interesting take on the kind of dystopian future that Atwood was describing. But literally on the top it says, brilliant, endlessly rich, pairs well with 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale. That's John Green. I don't know if that's the John Green or just a John Green, but John Green said that. And when I had originally, because I was the one who proposed this book, when I originally said that, oh, I heard it's kind of like The Handmaid's Tale but better, a girl in the group had already read the book but was still willing to reread it. Was like, I don't know about that. I don't think that's particularly accurate. And she was right. It's not particularly accurate, but I still think it's funny that I heard that. And then it's also written on the book, and both of us are like, I think it pairs well, like, yeah, pairing well, but not necessarily are they exact. Like, I wouldn't exactly put them like one-on-one, you know? Maybe in the same month, as you're reading one, you can read another and compare. But I do think it's beautiful. It's also very sad because there is a sequel to this, and from what I understand, it's almost like the daughter of Lauren. But I'm sad because there was like Octavia Butler had like plans for several more books, but then she passed away, and honestly I absolutely wish that I could like read the final installation, you know, perhaps hundreds of years after this original book, when Lauren is seen as a prophet, a messiah-like character. It's really good. I'm not being too specific about the story because like a lot of stuff does happen that is not necessarily surprising, but like worth figuring out as you read, especially if you don't like spoilers. I love spoilers. I definitely watched reviews of this book, including the crash course on it, which is, you know, hosted by John Green. Yeah, I definitely like this one. But yeah, so those were the books that I almost all finished in October. Let me know if you've read any of these, what you think of them. Hopefully, while this is a very nice cozy setup, hopefully I'll film in like a vaguely more appropriate setting next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.